So I want to think today about a 20th century arrival on the horizon that provided great reliability to the Old Testament in the Bible. I don't think it was expected, but it was quite important for Bible believers. Today, we can get most media, including Bibles, on or via a hard drive on our computer or phone. Back at the time Bible books were being written, writing was done using natural materials that rotted away: paper, animal skin, soot. You may ask how we can possibly trust those words written down centuries ago, then copied by people and copied again and again. Today, we will look at a surprising discovery of documents in jars that provided great reliability assurance about the scrolls of the Old Testament. So a typical Old Testament manuscript looked like this, or like this picture at the bottom of this slide, the first slide. But this one is in better condition than the previous picture. Use of modern computerized printing press provides the opportunity to get it right. Have you ever tried to copy an entire book of the Bible without making a mistake? Where once it's in the computer, you just push print or copy, and it automatically copies what you've got. So that when the print run is set up correctly, there's no way mistakes are going to be copied, because you've, in theory, eliminated the mistakes. However, handwritten scrolls did not come with that certainty. People understood this, and rules developed to discipline the work of scribes. That was what you called the people who wrote scrolls. And in India today, you can still see scribes. People go to them who cannot write their own documents or letters and get the scribe to do the work and pay him a small amount of money. So the ones that we know about of these copying rules are called the Masoretic copying rules. One group of people known as Masoretes, not sure of the pronunciation, sorry, were scribes and knew how important it was that scrolls be copied accurately. Here are some of their rules dating from around the 8th century AD. AD being the time system that we are in, so that it's now 2020 AD. So 2020 minus 1300, you're back in the 8th century. This means 8 centuries after Jesus Christ was born. So here's their rules. The whole scroll must be ruled before a word was written. The ink must be black, made from soot, charcoal, and honey. Each line was to contain exactly 30 letters. Each column was to contain an even number of lines, the same number throughout the scroll. no letter or word was to be written from memory. Each word must be studied in the original manuscript and spoken aloud before being copied. The document was checked using word and letter counts. The entire scroll was checked by a supervisor, and if mistakes were found, the document was to be destroyed. So you can see that they're eliminating mistakes that could be copied into the future. But there was no proof that this was accurate because the old document was worn out and gone. These rules were all very well, but surely there were still errors. After all, humans make mistakes, and a mistake once made would be copied and repeated forever afterwards. What about the accuracy of the scrolls they copied to make the first printing machine Bibles? How accurate were they? Where did they come from? Who knew how accurate they were? Well, no one really. Their work was based on faith in those who had gone before and those people's honor and respect for God and the holy documents that they were copying. So where did the Old Testament scrolls come from that were the base for the first printed English Bible? That Bible's been called the Geneva Bible. And here's a quote from Wikipedia about the Geneva Bible. Like most English translations of the time, the Geneva Bible was translated from scholarly editions of the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew scriptures that comprise the Old Testament. The English rendering was substantially based on the earlier translations by William Tyndale and Miles Coverdale. The Genevan Bible relies significantly upon Tyndale. However, the Geneva Bible was the first English version in which all of the Old Testament was translated directly from the Hebrew. So they've got a scroll which they're going to convert into a bound book. So how old were the scrolls that they were using? The Old Testament scrolls they used were all copied by the Masoretes. The Masoretes were groups of Jewish scribe scholars who worked between the 6th and 10th centuries AD, so just over 1,000 years ago from our time. And there's a lot about them in Wikipedia if you want more information about those people and who they were. They were based mainly in Tiberias, which is on the Sea of Galilee, Jerusalem, and Iraq. They copied, edited, and distributed copies of the Hebrew and Aramaic books of the Old Testament. They also collectively worked out a vowel system for Hebrew language, which you can read about in the Wikipedia article. Therefore, the scrolls used for the printed Bible dated from the 6th to 10th centuries AD. So that means for the Old Testament ones, the scrolls the printing press was 1455, so they're 600-700 years old, which isn't very old in Bible original writing terms. I've got more about that on another slide. So what about the New Testament scrolls? What did they copy that from? The New Testament scrolls used were from the 4th century, from a Latin translation of the New Testament called the Vulgate. So the New Testament was written in Greek. It's already been translated into Latin, and then they used that to translate into English and convert the Bible from a scroll to a bound book. The Catholic Church made the Vulgate their official Latin version of the Bible in the 16th century. So in Catholic Church terms, the Vulgate is authoritative, and that's why it was used. The oldest surviving complete Vulgate New Testament today manuscript is from the 8th century. So here's Wikipedia again. The Vulgate was the source text used for many translations of the Bible into vernacular languages. In English, the interlinear translation of the Lindisfarne Gospels, as well as other Old English Bible translations, the translation of John Wycliffe, the Douay-Rheims Bible, the Confraternity Bible, and Ronald Knox's translation were all made from the Vulgate, just in case you needed to understand its authority. The scrolls used for printed Bibles were therefore quite young, having been created long after the time of Jesus Christ. At printing time, the scrolls must have been about 500 years old. But the Bible books had been written between 1,300 and 2,900 years before that. That's many centuries of copying and lots of possibility for mistakes. Then, in the 20th century, in the 1940s, an unexpected discovery provided a reliable way to check the copying accuracy of the scribes for all those centuries. Between 1946 and 1956, ancient scrolls were discovered in clay jars in the Dead Sea area in Israel. The documents in the jars. So the Dead Sea Scrolls here on the map, you can see the area marked under the circle, and there is one of the jars. There's a story that goes with this discovery about shepherd boy throwing stones. Here's into the caves for something to do. Here's the tinkle, tinkle, tinkle as the stones hit the jars and goes to investigate. Don't know how true that story is. You can read up for yourselves. There's lots of info out there about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I also read that some of them actually found their way into the second-hand market and were bought by collectors for small money, but it was a lot of money to the people who found them in the first place. So I don't know that the collection of Dead Sea Scrolls that I think is in a museum in Israel and various other places around the world, I don't know whether that's all that originally was there, but there's heaps there. I promise you there were heaps there. So all of the Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated to having been written between 150 BC and 250 AD. So these scrolls had sat there for nearly 2,000 years. That means they are about 1,000 years older than the Masoretic scrolls. So they could put one beside the other. Even though the scrolls are not in perfect condition, sufficient was there for them to do a comparison test. And the differences found are minor and unimportant and don't change the meaning or take away the authority of the message. Because of their great age, 2,000 years or more, they provide amazing evidence that the Old Testament was faithfully copied by scribes for centuries. Quite an incredible story, actually. And the accuracy of copying provides evidence that for future generations, God was managing the process of preserving his message so that people could trust it. And now we have the evidence that we can look back and show how meticulous those scribes actually were. So here's a picture of the Wikipedia Dead Sea Scrolls entry. In the picture, they're talking about the Psalms scroll, which you can see they've got an official 11Q5 reference. One of the 981 texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What a treasure trove they found. So each one, someone has catalogued. So the material of this scroll was papyrus, parchment, and bronze. The writing is mostly Hebrew, with Aramaic, Greek, and Nabatean Aramaic. This scroll was believed to be created somewhere between 408 BC and 318 AD, or Christian era, which is the new name for AD. Discovered between 1946 and 1956, and the present location is various places in the world. So that's just one picture on the Wikipedia entry. There must be a catalogue like that somewhere that you might even be able to find online. But I thought that's really interesting to give us an insight into what these scrolls actually were like. And here's a picture of the caves at Qumran, which if you go to southern Israel and down towards the Dead Sea area, it's this very, very barren desert area where there's lots and lots of caves. And here is a very typical jar, which is why they survived for so long, because this kept them dry in a very dry area anyway, and protected them from being eaten by animals and insects. They're believed to belong to a group, have originally belonged to a group of people called Essenes. And again, you can research that on Wikipedia, that they were a religious group of Jews, I believe. This is part of the Isaiah scroll, the longest and oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In our Bible, Isaiah is one of the older books, and it has 66 chapters. If I remember correctly, this scroll is the most complete of all the books of the Old Testament that were found at Qumran. So it's been a treasure for scholars and religious people to be able to study. Most of the scrolls were discovered in early 1947. About 800 different manuscripts were found. Every book of the Old Testament was there, except Esther. And I find that quite fascinating. Maybe these were written before Esther, or because Esther was in far southern Iraq, it didn't get to these Essenes. Whatever, I don't know the answer to that, but it's an amazing thing that this resource of 800 different manuscripts. And several copies of some books were found, including Isaiah, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Genesis. So that again gave a resource comparing if there was decay or damage. Hopefully those bits were in one of the other copies of that book to be compared. Because of their age, the Dead Sea Scrolls help us put dates to prophecies. So the Old Testament has many predictions and foretellings of events that were going to happen later in God's plan for mankind and for the world. Before the scrolls were found, some critics claimed that the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus Christ, such as in Psalm 22 and the book of Isaiah, the critics said, oh, well, they wrote them after Jesus Christ lived, and so then they could make the prediction match the reality. But that could no longer be said once they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they predate Jesus Christ. So here's an example. By reading the New Testament, we are privileged to be able to learn how the Old Testament prophecies came about. For example, Isaiah chapter 53. Now I'm going to read you some parts of Isaiah 53. It's one of the iconic chapters of the Old Testament because it appears to be, reading its surface value, surface words, a prediction of someone who was to come. It says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our iniquities. He was for our transgressions, He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. I don't know how much all of you know about the crucifixion of Jesus. I think most people have some idea about the crucifixion. So when I put up this picture here with the man carrying a cross and the words, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, you can see that this is a prediction about Jesus Christ being pierced with the nails in his hands and feet for our transgressions. There's another verse some more verses in Isaiah. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Therefore I will give him, says God, a portion among the great, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. That prophecy was written approximately 700 years before Jesus Christ was born. And the Dead Sea Scroll, dated to BC, before Jesus even existed, put to rest the critics' claim that Isaiah was written after Jesus. Isaiah 53 is such a graphic description of what happened to Jesus Christ that it is amazing and establishes that Isaiah is not a forgery written after Jesus, after all. So let's think about the New Testament. How do we verify those scrolls? First of all, the New Testament was written in Greek, which was the language of the Roman Empire at that time, the common language of most people. Now, the New Testament is well supported by external manuscripts, external to the Vulgate. So if we took those Vulgate scrolls and lined them up and said, is this the only evidence we have of the New Testament? We might say, dodgy. Maybe they were written by one person. However, look at this. The New Testament has been preserved in more than 5,800 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient languages, including Syriac, Slavic, Ethiopic, and Armenian. Even if the original Greek versions were lost, the entire New Testament could still be assembled from the translations. You can check this out for yourself, Wikipedia New Testament page. So here's a quote from a writer around 1960. The evidence, now this is comparing, you will have heard of Plato and Aristotle and those famous Greek philosophers. So this person is comparing the evidence for the New Testament against the existing evidence for those philosophers. The evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. So I'll show you a chart in a minute of the number of documents that support the existence of those philosophers. And nobody dreams of questioning that they were real people whose writings are from a real person and can be trusted. However, people threw brickbats at the Bible and said, oh no, it's just human writings, you can't trust it. So this writer goes on to say, if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, secular meaning outside faith, not a faith collection, if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt. And there's the source of that quote, Professor Bruce, in his book, The New Testament Documents, written in 1960. So here's a chart so that you can see on the left-hand column is various famous historians and philosophers, and their original works are believed, the dates are in the second column, written. So for example, if we go on the top line, Caesar wrote some stuff, and it was written between 100 and 44 BC. The earliest copy that we have is dated AD 900. So 1,000 years after Caesar wrote. That's the oldest scroll that is available in the world today. And there are 10 copies of that. So if we work down, we've got somebody called Livy, written 59 BC to AD 17. Don't know the dates of the earliest copy, but we've got 20 copies of that person's writing. Pop down to Pliny the Younger, written in the 1st century, AD 61 to 113. The earliest copy we have of that is AD 850, so 750 years after he wrote, and we've only got one copy of that. And again, it's taken as authentic, his writing. Of course, that can't be disproved. So pop down now right to the bottom in the pink. The New Testament was written between AD 40 and AD 100. The earliest copy we have is dated 125, 25 years after it was written. Cast your eyes above. All the others are hundreds of years, hundreds and hundreds of years. They're only 25 years. And look at the number of copies. 24,000 copies of various New Testament documents exist. So the point of the person who constructed this chart, which wasn't me, I've borrowed it, is that you look at the copies of these people's writings and you don't say, oh, they're not authentic. But people have tried to say that about the New Testament. And look at the weight of evidence. It's huge in comparison to the weight of evidence for the existence of Pliny the Younger, or let's go down near the bottom, Homer. Wow, that's old, 400 BC. Wow, that is a very old document. And there's 643 copies of bits Homer wrote. So hopefully that you can see the New Testament has far greater support from ancient manuscripts. There's another source of confirmation of the New Testament, and it is other people's writings. Surviving writings of early church believers also provide confirmation of the accuracy of the New Testament. Leaders of the Christian church, about 100 to 200 years after Jesus, quoted many of the New Testament books. For example, pardon if my pronunciation is not correct for these, Ignatius Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement, Origen, and Tertullian. I don't have those writings, but I expect we could find them on the internet. Well, thank you to the internet for the magic of that these days. However, here's a quote from Professor Metzger, if that's how you say his name. Indeed, so extensive are these citations that if all other sources of our knowledge of the text of the New Testament was destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. All right, so we've got all these cut and paste bits from Justin Martyr or Ignatius or Clement, and we put them all out on the table, all their quotes. We could put them together and just about make a full New Testament. So as external evidence, they give credibility to these Vulgate books of the New Testament that dated to about the 4th or 5th century. So God hasn't left us with just the ink on paper. He's left us with lots of other stuff about that we can go back and say, yes or no. So let's review the evidence that we've looked at over the last 3 seminars about the Bible. It has been the best-selling book since it first went into print. It is the most translated of all books anywhere. People have tried to suppress or eliminate it unsuccessfully. So, bestseller, they don't even bother to report it anymore, but I found that 100 million are printed or sold or given away every year. Nearly 700 languages for the full Bible translation, and very active opposition over centuries and even today. But it still thrives. There's got to be something in those. The writers and their words were subjected to hundreds of years of authenticity tests by critical audiences. There's a lot in that, because if you or I publish something and put it out there in the public domain, it will get brickbats or bouquets thrown at it. So that's what happened here. The writers and their words were subjected to hundreds of years of authenticity tests by critical audiences. Public consensus, not one person, not a Christian church, established which books were included in the Bible. There are some books that did not pass the public consensus test and are not included in the majority of Bibles. I personally believe that's a really interesting phenomenon, that you cannot say people with vested interest chose which books go in the Bible. People with vested interests did not choose to publicize it. It just kept on going and going and going. The ever-ready Bible. And accuracy of the test can be established. First, the Old Testament through discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the documents in the jars. By the way, The word docs on my slide, in legal jargon, in a legal office in New Zealand, if you have a number of documents, instead of writing DOCUMENTS, you write DOX. It means more than one document. So the accuracy of the text of the Old Testament can be established, has been established, through discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the docs in the jars. The New Testament accuracy can be established by comparison with later writers who quoted it. You put all those together. The Bible claims to be a life-changing message of good things from God. That's the evidence that we have considered in this series of seminars up to date. So next week, the subject is acres and epochs. We're going to look at the geography of the Bible. What countries is it set in at the time it was written? And how do we figure out what time in history the Bible fits into? So acres for the geography and epochs for time. See you then, God willing. Next Thursday, 28th of May, 12:30 New Zealand time. Same go to meeting, and there's the ID.